Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues and Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to stand in the House today to participate in this debate over C-40, an act respecting the Rouge National Urban Park. While I stand in support of this bill, Mr. Speaker, at this stage of the legislative process, my remarks today are by no means free of criticism of this bill. In fact, this speech, as with all the speeches from the NDP caucus, are intended to send a clear message that significant amendments need to be made to this bill in order to garner support through to the end of the legislative process. But the criticism herein, Mr. Speaker, is of course intended to be constructive. It is a plea to this government to raise its sights, its ambitions, and do three things: realize the great potential of this project, realize the dreams of a whole lot of hard-working citizens who always had before them a clear sense of the great potential of this project, and set a precedent of a new kind of Canadian park, a national urban park. There is an existing Rouge Park, Mr. Speaker, at 47 square kilometers. It is one of North America's largest and sits amidst about 20% of Canada's total population. The park is rich in its diversity of nature and culture. It includes a rare Carolinian forest, numerous species at risk, internationally significant geological outcroppings from the interglacial age, and evidence of human history dating back 10,000 years, including some of Canada's oldest known Aboriginal historic sites and villages. These resources have been under the stewardship of the Rouge Park Alliance, an alliance of many groups, Mr. Speaker, including dedicated citizen groups, for many years. But there is now before us the opportunity to move this park and add other resources to it under the stewardship of Parks Canada and its commitment to ecological integrity. So the proposed Rouge National Urban Park should provide protection and restoration of forests and wetland areas to soften the impacts of urban growth, improve the quality of water entering Lake Ontario, reduce the risks of climate change, related flooding, erosion and property damage, and improve habitat for rare and endangered species. This is important, Mr. Speaker. We have built our cities and continue to build our cities with insufficient care and respect for the ecological integrity of the nature that runs through them and borders them. And more than that, with insufficient care and attention to the application of the notion of ecological integrity to how we build and grow cities themselves. There is a certain bitter irony in this, Mr. Speaker, as pointed out in a report by Ontario Nature and the Suzuki Foundation entitled Biodiversity in Ontario's Greenbelt. Humans chose to settle in this part of Ontario in large part because of the rich diversity and fertility of the land. Millions now make their home in this region, as do a large number of our most enchanting species at risk. So evidence of that once beautiful natural landscape remains in Toronto. A recent Toronto Star article put it this way, and I quote, "The city of Toronto was built on the backs of its rivers. 9 rivers and creeks flow through its rich valleys and pour into Lake Ontario, making rivers as essential a part of Toronto's landscape as the CN Tower or Queen's Park." Said Robert Fulford in his book, Accidental City, "The ravines are to Toronto what canals are to Venice and hills are to San Francisco," end quote. Some of those rivers, Mr. Speaker, were lost, but have since been found. Groups like the Toronto Green Community and the Toronto Field Naturalists actually provide lost river walks in the city. But some, the Humber, the Don, and the Rouge, their various branches and tributaries, remain essential to what Toronto is, and more importantly, remain essential to visions of what Toronto could actually be if we took care to restore and preserve their ecological integrity. There are innumerable groups on the ground in our urban communities, Mr. Speaker, animated by a vision of preserving and restoring the natural and cultural heritage of these rivers, preserving and restoring that which brought people to settle this and live off this part of the land in the first place. In my riding, for example, the Taylor Massey project was developed by a group of volunteers a decade ago for the purpose of increasing community awareness of this 16-kilometer watercourse and for the purpose of restoring the natural heritage of the creek's valley lands and to improve the water quality and aquatic habitats of this urban creek. The Taylor Massey Creek, Mr. Speaker, flows into the Don River. By 1969, the Don River was reportedly not much more than a city sewer. That prompted some to call it dead. And so on November 16th of that year, 200 mourners paraded from the University of Toronto campus down to the banks of the Don in a mock funeral procession, complete with hearse. If it was indeed dead, Mr. Speaker, then it has risen from the dead, thanks to the efforts of countless citizens, but not yet fully recovered, Mr. Speaker, because much more effort is required. And I am thankful for those who commit their free time and energy to its revitalization and to realize for their own projects, for their own communities, for the benefit of all of us, Mr. Speaker, what we have now the opportunity to do for the Rouge River. What we have here in this legislation is a great opportunity. With respect to the Rouge, so many people have brought us to this point where this land can be brought under the stewardship of Parks Canada, because the objective of Parks Canada, and I now quote from their website, Mr. Speaker, is to allow people to enjoy national parks as special places without damaging their integrity. In other words, ecological integrity is our endpoint for park management, end quote. But, Mr. Speaker, rather than bringing to the urban park the same commitment, indeed legislatively set out priority to ecological integrity that is applied to its other parks, this legislation sheds that commitment and shakes loose that priority. C-40, in fact, requires only that the minister, and I quote, take into consideration the protection of its natural ecosystems and cultural landscapes and the maintenance of its native wildlife and of the health of those ecosystems, end quote. This flies, Mr. Speaker, in the face of Parks Canada's own governing legislation and policies that specify the maintenance or restoration of ecological integrity through the protection of natural resources and natural processes, and the fact that that, Mr. Speaker, shall be the first priority of the minister when considering all aspects of the management of its parks. What's more, Mr. Speaker, this language affords, according to a recent legal review by EcoJustice, thank you, significantly less protection than Ontario's Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act, and in failing to do so would appear to be an obvious breach of the Memorandum of Agreement between Parks Canada and the Ontario Government, which requires, Mr. Speaker, that the policies that govern the Rouge National Urban Park meet or exceed provincial policies. This, Mr. Speaker, is how we end up in this position with the Ontario government withholding the transfer of lands to Parks Canada until the federal government commits, in effect, and really quite perversely, to live up to its own legislative priorities and commitments. So the bill needs to change, Mr. Speaker, so that it is consistent with the Canada National Parks Act and lives up to commitments made to the Government of Ontario so that we can get on with the great opportunity of creating a first and great national urban park along the Rouge watershed. Let me conclude by saying, with respect to the many who are putting their minds and energy to this issue, that we haven't really arrived at a clear understanding of what the ecological integrity of the urban actually looks like. But I approach that issue with the same optimism, the same ambition as I do this legislation, Mr. Speaker. The urban and the concept of ecological integrity ought not to stand in contradistinction. Indeed, in light of the incredible rate of urbanization globally, we have to make meaningful the notion of urban ecological integrity. A first national urban park is the first good step along that path. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.